Let's get into some seam sewing practice. I have cut a whole stack of muslin. This is actually really lightweight muslin. Doesn't really matter. These are 3.5 inches wide by 8 inches long. And I suggest cutting a huge big stack of them like this because you'll want to practice, especially if you're not used to using an industrial machine. So I'm just going to put them to the side here and grab a couple of pieces. You'll see on my machine there is a seam gauge. This one is in metric, so it is in centimeters. You might find you want something like this. This is a seam gauge that you can, it's magnetic, and you can put it anywhere along here that you want, but I don't really use it. I just wanted to show you. The first seam we're going to sew is our typical 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I have right sides together. And I'm going to start with a back tack, and then I'm just going to make sure that my edges are aligned, and I'm going to align this edge with the 1 centimeter mark. You should be able to put a seam gauge on there, and it should be really exactly that 1 centimeter. So this seam is typically finished somehow with a serger or something and then pressed to one side, closed. When a seam is this narrow, just 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter, we typically don't press it open. The next seam is a 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeter seam allowance. You can use a seam gauge, okay? And if you look here, 1/2 an inch falls about in between the 1 and 1.5 centimeter mark, but you will learn to just eye judge that. Some machines, especially older machines, so if you pick up an older used industrial, they don't have any markings on here. So you can use painter's tape or masking tape. Like, never use just magic tape like Scotch tape because it doesn't come off very well. To create a seam guide for you, like, you can just stick it on, or you can use the magnetic one. But I think it's actually a really great skill to learn to eye judge it. So I'm eye judging just how far away from that line I am. If I didn't have any lines on here, I would eye judge how far away the needle, the edge of the foot was from the edge of the fabric. Okay, because this is a wider seam, very often this is finished separately and pressed open like this. When we say finished, we mean serged or overlocked or something else, but we'll be getting into that later. So just finger press that open. You'll press it with an iron. The next one is a French seam, and I would have to say this one is used and abused by the internet. So I'm just going to get a pencil. It's used and abused by the internet, and I say that because people use this on just totally the wrong fabrics. This is now a floral fabric. It's only really suitable for fine or thin fabrics because you'll see it creates quite a lot of bulk. If you use it on a thick fabric, such as linen, or a thicker cotton, you will create a lot of bulk and the seam won't have any flexibility in it, and that will suck, basically. It's not what you want. What this is really good for is very sheer fabrics, silks, satins, fabrics with a lot of flow to them. So the difference with this one is, instead of sewing it right sides together, we're going to start with wrong sides together. So this is a floral fabric now. I'm going to start with it wrong sides together. And this depends on your seam allowance, but generally speaking, you do a 1/4 inch or 5 millimeter first pass with wrong sides together. Okay, if you are doing very fine work, you might even trim that back to just a millimeter or two. It depends on the fabric. Like if you're doing very fine lingerie, that's what you do. Now you'll press it like this, and you'll press it back again. This is what is called an enclosed seam. So now it's actually sitting right sides together, and we're just going to sew a second seam. I'm going to do it at 1 centimeter just to show you, but typically it would be smaller than that. You will also use an iron to press it instead of your fingers. Okay. That's your French seam. Right sides, just a clean seam. Insides, also a very clean seam. Next up, we're going to flat fell a seam. Now, there are many different ways to do this. This is the way that I would suggest. So, on an industrial pattern, the seam allowances will be different on the two sides, but not always. I mean, for your own purposes, they might not be, in which case you would just trim them back. But I'm going to show you the non-trimming method. So you're going to offset the two. So this is, it can be right sides together, it can be wrong sides together. Let's do it the typical way. Here are my flowers. Okay, typically speaking, we would do it wrong sides together. And we would place it just offset. So this side would actually have a bigger seam allowance than that side. You'll see why that is in just a minute. So you'll offset them by 1/4 inch. This edge here is running along my 1 centimeter line. This edge here is running along the edge of my foot. Now, if you didn't already have that set up like that, it's okay. You just sew them with the same seam allowance and you trim one side back. Now you're going to press the longer side over. Okay, so I pressed it with an iron. This is the edge folded under. This is opened out. This is the right sides of the fabric. Now you can see that line of stitching. This is, you know, you see this on jeans or something, right? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the inside edge of the presser foot down this folded line as I sew. There we go. You have 2 parallel rows of stitching there. And on the other side, you have like a seam here and 1 row of essentially like top stitching. Sometimes like on shirts, like shirt armholes, you might actually see this being the right side. And so you just have the 1 clean seam and the other one, just 1 line of top stitching, but it depends. You can You can decide which look you prefer. I'm going to show you a pin stitched and top stitched finish now. This is a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and I've just pressed it to the side to this side. Typically you would finish that with a serger. We're going to start with a pin stitch. Sometimes it's called an edge stitch, but I call it a pin stitch. And it's called a pin stitch because you're sewing a pin's width away from something. It could be on the edge of a collar. In this case, it's this seam. So on your industrial sewing machine foot, or on any sewing machine foot, I suppose, but especially in an industrial, this open toe here, this inside edge of the presser foot is what I'm going to use as a guide. And you just, honestly, just get really good at seeing it. Typically speaking, use a longer stitch length for visible stitching. So I sew all my construction seams for most fabrics in 2.5 seam stitch length. For visible sewing like this, I sew it at a 3. So I'm just making sure that the inside edge is always running along this seam. Okay. That is a really good skill to practice. I would practice that a lot. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to top stitch next to it. And this is going to end up looking a lot like that flat felled seam on the right side, but not on the wrong side. So you can do it either way. You can run, basically we were running the outer edge of that presser foot down that line of stitching that we just did. So that is a 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters. There we go. So this is another kind of eye judging thing. There we go. So perfectly parallel. So what I'll be looking for is for your pin stitching to be really accurate and consistent, and the same with the second line of stitching. Can you see how perfect it is? It's really, really neat and accurate. On the wrong side, we can see, you can actually see the original seam line. You can see then the 2 rows of top stitching. Typically this would be finished with a serger, as I said. And this, you could also call this a faux flat felled seam. But this is, I'm calling it a pin stitched and top stitched finish. I'm going to show you the easiest way I know how to do a baby hem. This is called band roll, and you can buy it in the garment district, and it's used in waistbands to really stiffen it, especially in menswear. So the first thing you're going to do, it takes a bit of setup, but you are going to trim off one edge, but you have to make sure that you're trimming exactly along one of the, I suppose they're threads. So I'm going to trim one edge off. I'll continue doing that off camera. You can see here I went a bit off, so I have to make sure that I do it exactly along one of the threads. So I'll do that all the way along. Then what I'll do is I'll remove the next thread along like this, and I'll keep doing that until it is I suppose it's made of plastic actually, until it is the depth of the baby hem that I want. So something like that. I'll do that and then I'll be back. Okay, so I've prepped my band roll. If you were doing this on a garment, you would prep it like the entire length of the hem. And once you have it, you keep it. Okay, so this is about 4-ish millimeters of like teeth. You can see it's kind of formed like a bit of a comb. This is the piece that I'm going to do the baby hem on. Just going to cut off this end. There we go. Okay, so the first pass. So what's going to happen is this is the right side of the fabric, and I'm going to sew it on, and then I'm going to use this as a tool to roll it. Okay, so I'm going to pin stitch this on. The kind of comb edge is right against the edge of the fabric. Okay, so now you're going to make sure that you don't pull it off, but you're just going to carefully roll it under like that. Do you see that? So on this side, this is the wrong side, it's rolled under. Okay, so I have it pressed under like this. I'm going to sew from the right side. Am I? No, I'm going to sew from the wrong side, sorry. Making sure that I'm running that folded edge against the inside edge of the presser foot. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pull this band roll out. There we go. We have a really neat baby hem there. Double turned. Extra threads there. Okay. So that's what that looks like. You can use this along the edge of the dress and the hem. You could even use it on the neckline. It's a bit tricky there, but that's how you would do that. Okay, we're going to set up some gathers now. I've got a long piece of fabric that I'm going to gather into a shorter piece of fabric. Now, we do gathers based on ratios. Basically, if you're gathering something, you'll want to do a whole bunch of samples at different ratios. So, you know, twice as long. The absolute minimum would be 1.5 times the original length, and that's really stingy, and I don't like stingy gathers. So don't do that. You'll want to have your machine set up so it does not back tack, and the stitch length is very long. I've got it set on about a 4. So for the first pass, you're going to sew a 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters from the edge. Okay, and then for your second pass, depends how big your seam allowance is. I'm pretending there's a 1 centimeter seam allowance, so I want to do it so it actually is wider than that seam allowance. So I'm going to do 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. It doesn't have to be the world's neatest sewing either, because these are basting threads and they're going to come out, they're gathering threads. Okay, now remember to shorten your stitch length. I always try to do it right after I've run the gathering threads in. Okay, typically we find the bobbin threads. Sometimes a pin can be helpful for this. So we're going to use the bottom and we just fray out a stitch or two. Getting that out of the way. Don't know what that is. Just enough so you can grab it. So I'm grabbing the 2 bobbin threads at the same time, and I'm pulling them. You only pull from one side, so the bobbin thread side is the kind of side that is typically the one that we do, and then distribute the gathers. What I actually like to do is this. So I'll pull out a bit of a tail on one side, and then I get a pin and I'll pop it here, and then I just wrap these around the pin in a figure 8, and that is to anchor it, because what can happen is you can just end up like pulling your gathering threads out all together. So then I go from the other end, same side, I'm still on the bobbin thread side, and do the same thing. And then there we go. So I'm just gathering it up evenly. Okay. I'm gathering it into this piece. These are going to be pretty aggressive gathers. It's okay. So what I generally do is I get it to about the length it needs to be. This is maybe too aggressive. Very tight, but that's okay. I'll do it like this, to about that length. So I get it to the length that I want, or very close to it. Then I get another pin, and I anchor that end. Now, if you have a really long piece of gathering, it's really nice to have both ends kind of in action. Like you can undo these thread anchors and adjust it from either end, because you can pull from both ends. So you can see there's some bunchy bits. So what I do is you're just going to evenly distribute those gathers neatly along the whole line. Spend some time doing this. There have been times when I have gotten really grumpy and haven't, and I have regretted it afterwards, and then I am embarrassed to wear that garment. So don't let that be you. Okay. Any kind of like puckery bits like this, we want the gathers to be kind of straight. So you can kind of go through like this. If you're going to be really precise. If you're doing a mountain of gathers, like a tiered dress, you probably won't want to do that. Okay, now we're going to sew them on. So sew them on right sides together. Some people like to put the gathers on the underside. Some people like to put them on the top. It's really up to you. Okay. Got my stitch length shortened again. Got my back tacking on.
Starts reverse stitch a single, ends reverse stitch a single.
Okay, and I'm gonna remove this pin here and just hold it with my finger, and I'm gonna sew this on using a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm just lining up the cut edges. This is right sides together. You can see, actually, I kind of do this automatically, but you can see I'm kind of, the way I'm holding it with my fingers, keeping them out of the way. If that makes you nervous, use some tweezers. A pair of tweezers here is not a bad thing, because you might want to like arrange your gathers as you go. Like if you're doing something really precision with your gathers, you might want to play with them and manipulate them as you sew. You can see here is a bit of a flat bit, so I'm just gonna lift the presser foot and just arrange things. There we go. When I flip it down, we can still see this gathering thread here, so we need to pull it out. It's very easy to pull out. These threads that we're using were temporary, and if we just keep pulling on them, they will eventually just pull out. Try not to break them, because then it's actually harder. It just pulls out just like that on that side, and then on this side, these are now loose, and you can just remove them. It's a pretty intense gathers here. Now, you can just press this up, making sure you don't press the gathers flat. Make sure your iron goes kind of in between the gathers. Or you can have it pressed, or you can pin stitch that down, whatever you prefer. So those are gathers.